The death toll from Hurricane Helene has reached 190, making it the worst killer since Hurricane Katrina nearly 20 years ago. Floods devastated Asheville and other towns in North Carolina, where the elevation usually keeps people safe. Georgia and Florida also suffered terrible damage. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, will get Asheville back on its feet, along with all the other places that were wrecked, right? Well, according to FEMA's guidelines, white people are last in line for relief. Take a look at this 144-page handbook, Achieving Equitable Recovery. The very first page says, instilling equity as a foundation of emergency management is goal 1 of the 2022-2026 FEMA strategic plan. Equity means underserved groups come first because they have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life. They are Black, Latino, and Indigenous and Native American persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and other persons of color, members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer persons, persons with disability, persons who live in rural areas. The only persons not included are Christian, white, heterosexuals who systematically deny opportunity to everyone else. FEMA explains that the higher the number of isms you face, i.e. racism, sexism, ageism, the higher your risks before, during, and after a disaster. This shows how different isms pile up to an alarming degree. One-legged Muslim African lesbians are first in line for disaster relief. I'm only half joking. FEMA explains that equity means you have to generate a data-informed picture of recovery needs before disaster strikes. That's because inequities that existed prior to a disaster are often exacerbated by the disaster, e.g., disparities caused by racism or poverty. FEMA urges you to go to the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which has already done some of the work for you. It calculates a social vulnerability index for every American county based on socioeconomic status, household characteristics, housing type and transport access, and of course, race. This is Buncombe County, North Carolina, where flood-stricken Asheville is located. Here's the vulnerability of all counties. Dark is bad, light is good. It is critical for local officials and leaders to advance equity and recovery by leveraging available data to inform the recovery process, says FEMA. The top 2 goals of equitable recovery are to address long-standing recovery issues and to correct any prior underinvestment and pre-existing inequities. As Kamala Harris likes to say,
so there's a big difference between equality and equity. Equality suggests often everybody should get the same thing. Well, that often assumes everybody started out in the same place, as opposed to equity, which is everyone should end up in the same place.
FEMA is part of the Biden-Harris project to eliminate all gaps in the health, happiness, and welfare of all the people whom white folks have been systematically depriving. That's why underserved communities may receive a greater number of resources to achieve parity, and why disaster relief must address the pre-existing structural and social conditions to sustain improvements in parity of standards of living. Does fixing pre-existing social conditions include crime, poverty, drugs, terrible schools? You cannot have equitable recovery without building equity into the recovery organizational and coordination structure. I don't know how many lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer people there are in this picture, but the Asheville City Council is strong on equity, not one white man. And blacks are only 4.5% of the city population, so for them to have 43% of city council seats sounds about right. FEMA recommends a report by the NAACP called In the Eye of the Storm, a people's guide to transforming crisis and advancing equity in the disaster continuum. The goal is to transform a crisis to advance equity. This action toolkit is 193 pages long. I confess I did not read about the World Cafe method of transforming a crisis into equity, nor did I read about establishing a community emergency response team. FEMA directs you to a CDC guide called Human Trafficking in the Wake of a Disaster, with the usual concentration on vulnerable populations. FEMA warns that hate crimes are a bad problem during a disaster. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a dramatic increase in hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Here's a table showing the rise of hate crimes that FEMA will be on the lookout for as it hands out bottled water. After recovery, here are the key questions. How much post-disaster equity work did we accomplish? Are historically disadvantaged, underserved, and marginalized communities better off? If they were ever underserved, they better be overserved by the time FEMA goes home. This stuff is embarrassing. Are we really supposed to think that when boat operators pick up flood victims or firemen fight fires, they think about whether the people they are helping are Hindus or homosexuals? They're supposed to now. If FEMA does its job right, the Hindus and homosexuals will be better off than before the disaster. FEMA is also in the business of coddling illegals. It runs the Shelter and Services Program that pays for humanitarian services to non-citizen migrants following their release from the Department of Homeland Security. This doesn't even pretend to be disaster relief, unless you think of millions of illegals as a disaster, except that the relief goes to the illegals, not to us. More than $1 billion worth in the last 2 fiscal years, as you can see from this table. The money goes to NGOs, which do the actual housing and feeding. Catholics cleaned up, starting with Annunciation House, Bishop Enrique San Pedro Ozanam Center, and Catholic charities of all shapes and sizes. That's $1 billion not available for Americans who need help. Here's more FEMA mission creep. Its emergency food and shelter program feeds and houses people even if there hasn't been a disaster. Naturally, this now includes families and individuals encountered by the Department of Homeland Security, which means border hoppers. FEMA forks over the money to organizations assisting migrants. The amount grows every year, and last year was $425 million. That's a total of $715 million of your money that won't be helping the people who lived here. Sorry, hillbillies, the money is for Venezuelans and Haitians. Now, Alejandro Mayorkas warns FEMA doesn't have enough funding to last through hurricane season. I can't imagine why not. But I shouldn't pick on FEMA. On his first day in office, Joe Biden signed Executive Order 13985, which requires diversity, equity, and inclusion in every aspect of everything the government does every day, everywhere in the world. This website explains how all agencies make equity goal number 1. Just like FEMA. For example, the State Department promises to raise the visibility of racial and other inequities globally and generate better informed foreign policies to decrease barriers to equity and equality worldwide. So when the U.S. Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality talks about priority populations, that's not you, Whitey. Maybe you remember prioritizing minorities for coronavirus vaccination. So if you're in the Carolina Hills and the relief truck passes you by or doesn't even show up, just remember, FEMA's got higher priorities than white people. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this video channel. I invite you to visit amren.com, amren.com. You'll find videos, podcasts, articles, a lot of things I think will interest you. Thanks again for watching.